Tropical storm Florence continued to thrash the Carolinas early Saturday with fierce winds, driving rain and catastrophic flooding. Downgraded from hurricane strength after making landfall, the storm had killed at least 5 people, the authorities said, and trapped hundreds of others whose rescues continued as night fell. Among the dead were a mother and her infant child, who were killed after a tree fell on their house, the police said. The rains are anticipated to continue for days, and flooding is likely to worsen as more rivers spill over their banks. Florence made landfall around 7:15 a.m. Friday near Wilmington, North Carolina, as a Category 1 hurricane, with winds of about 90 miles an hour. By 2 a.m. Saturday, it had crossed into South Carolina about 25 miles west of Myrtle Beach, and the wind had dropped to 60 miles an hour. More than 360 people had been rescued in the coastal city of New Bern, North Carolina, by Friday evening, and another 140 were in need of help, a city spokeswoman said. There is plenty of past in this city, 308 years of it, colonial governors, Union troops, communities of freed slaves, and yes, hurricanes, plenty of them. But none of it, at least nothing that anyone alive could remember, seemed to prepare New Bern for Hurricane Florence. It's been flooding ever since our history started, said Steve Bengal, who was driving around the inundated city on Friday morning with his wife, Sabrina, a town alderwoman, and looking at one street that had been submerged in 5 feet of water. But none like this, she responded. New Bern and its 30,000 residents were overwhelmed by Hurricane Florence. Over 360 people had been rescued since Thursday night, from first floors, second floors, attics and rooftops. By Friday evening, the list had started to grow again, with 140 people in need of help. With the deterioration of the weather, people are calling back and saying, "The water is creeping back into my home. Can you please come get me?" said Colleen Roberts, a spokeswoman for the city. Places that had never flooded were taking on water, and places that had typically flooded a little were turned into lakes. The 2 rivers that come together at New Bern, the Neuse and Trent, were both repulsed by a storm surge swollen Pamlico Sound. Their waters emptied into the streets of the city instead. Comfortable neighborhoods of retirees were filling up along with the city's poorer districts. Most of one public housing complex now sat several feet deep in the engorged Trent River. The onslaught was nowhere near finished. The tide was coming in again, and the rainfall, projected to reach an astonishing 40 inches, was just getting started. The rescues were not finished, either. "As long as it doesn't come up to the 2nd floor, we'll be fine," said Cynthia Imento, who had left her steadily flooding 1-story home on Thursday afternoon to join 2 families in a 2-story dwelling up the street. The water level rose inside the house overnight, reaching about 7 feet. It receded a bit by morning, she said, but she knew it would come back again. "We are praying and hoping for the best," she said. The badly flooded areas were all around town, not isolated to just one spot, said Jamie Shaw Harris, an alderwoman, who heard from constituents whose relatives had fled to their roofs. "Downtown is literally underwater," she said. Since a mandatory evacuation was ordered for New Bern earlier in the week, city officials had tried to get word out. They knocked on doors, left flyers and drove the streets broadcasting on fire truck bullhorns. They offered rides. "If you were even afraid that you might flood," said Jeffrey T. Odom, an alderman who made the rounds, "then you probably could flood this time." The state had set up a shelter at a National Guard armory 2 hours inland, and hundreds had gone. 4 local shelters had been set up, as well, for last-minute deciders, and they filled up. But still, some people remained. They stayed because they were up there in age, on dialysis, because they did not hear of the mandatory evacuation, because they had faith that God would keep them safe, because they loved their homes and did not want to leave, because it had never flooded badly where they lived. But as Thursday afternoon turned to evening, it had become ever more clear that Hurricane Florence was not going to be like any storm in memory. Surge waters marched down streets and crept up front porches, knocking on windows and sending people to second floors, then attics, if they had them. It was close to dark, I'd say probably 5-6 o'clock, and these floodwaters were really starting to rise and were rising quickly, Mr. Odom said. People lost power all over town. A local television station, surrounded by floodwaters, had to evacuate in minutes, the weatherman walking off the set mid-broadcast. Those who did not get out had been told, if there is no room in the attic, go higher. And some did, clambering up onto the rooftops to wait. Friday's daylight revealed a city largely submerged, and a population stunned and scattered. Gerald Richmond, 35, sat in the darkness of a city parks and recreation bus with a family friend, an older woman in a housecoat. They were alone in the bus, having just decided to evacuate as the water inched up the front porch. We didn't think it was going to be this bad, he said as the rain pounded on the bus. Essence Keys, 25, left her apartment in Trent Court on Thursday afternoon, walking out the back door as water came in the front. She has been at a nursing home, where she works, ever since. Things have been hectic with the arrival of residents from another home. Her 2 little boys are in another part of town with her grandmother, who has no cell phone and no power, and thus no way to get in touch. As for the state of her own apartment, who can say? I don't have nothing but the clothes that I had on yesterday, Miss Keys said. Overnight, the door to Meghan Markle's house flew off, and the ground level started to fill with water. She called a friend, who called 911 and, told that conditions were too dangerous for rescue operations, dove into Facebook. Connections were made, friend to friend, and eventually to a group from Texas that arrived at Miss Markle's front door in a skiff on Friday morning. People had to improvise like that. The flooding is going to be something that in my lifetime I haven't seen before, Mr. Bingle, 62, said. I have never seen this amount of flooding. He and his wife had driven the town, seen his business that has been around for over a century surrounded by water, seen the flooding in Trent Court, looked down streets that descended into water, and had now returned to the downtown historic district of New Bern, a mix of Charleston and Williamsburg, as Miss Bingle put it. Oh gosh, Steve, she said, looking at the downtown. It's really bad here. They looked at the high tide watermark on a friend's home, 4 feet. The wind was whipping. They drove toward the mall, beyond the historic district, to see how it was holding up. A woman named Linda called on the phone. We survived last night. I figure we can survive anything, Linda said. Miss Bingle was not so sure. We're going to have at least another 24 hours of rain. Well, the Lord looked out for us last night, the woman on the phone said. Linda, it turned out, was Mr. Bingle's sister. She's the ear of the family, he said. You know, the sky is always falling. Today she may be right. The storm surge had reached 7 feet on Emerald Isle, North Carolina, and could climb as high as 11 feet elsewhere. More than 770,000 people have lost power in North Carolina. Rescuers spent hours trying to reach the mother and infant who died in Wilmington after they were trapped by a tree and a portion of the roof that had collapsed on them, said J.S. Mason, a deputy fire chief. Chief Mason said the 2 victims, who were not identified, died before they could be freed. The child's father was transported to the New Hanover Regional Medical Center with unspecified injuries. The sheer size of the tree was not something you could quickly cut with a chainsaw, Chief Mason said. It was a very difficult rescue that required some technical equipment. A woman died of a heart attack this morning in Hempstead, an unincorporated area of Pender County, North Carolina, officials said. Emergency crews responding to a 911 call tried to reach the woman's home but were delayed by downed trees on streets, said Chad McEwen, the assistant county manager. They eventually used a front loader to clear the way, he said. Another 2 people, both in their 70s, were killed in Lenoir County, one while trying to connect 2 extension cords outside in the rain, and the other when he went outside to check on his hunting dogs and was blown down by wind, the authorities said. Our hearts go out to the families of those who died in this storm, Governor Roy Cooper of North Carolina said. Hurricane Florence is going to continue its violent grind across our state for days. Be extremely careful and stay alert. 360 rescued, dozens more awaiting help as New Bern floods. Rescues continued throughout Friday in New Bern, a small city that sits at the confluence of 2 rivers that run into storm-swollen Pamlico Sound. More than 360 residents had been taken to safety by Friday afternoon, with 140 more still stranded. With the deterioration of the weather, people are calling back and saying, "The water is creeping back into my home. Can you please come get me?" said Colleen Roberts, a spokeswoman for the city. New Bern has not seen a storm like this since the 50s, the city's mayor, Dana Outlaw, said. "I think people just assume things like this just won't happen. It's everything that was predicted," he said. We asked readers living in Florence's projected path what they're doing for the storm. Read about their experiences. New Bern officials, the mayor and aldermen had gone around low-lying neighborhoods on Thursday urging people to leave and offering rides to shelters. Most did get out, the mayor estimated 70%, but not everyone. A lot of people, this is their whole lives and they had pride, and they did not want to leave, an alderwoman, Jamie Shaw Harris, said. Those same individuals that I knocked on their doors had family members calling me to say they're on their roof. The badly flooded areas are all around the town, not isolated to just one spot, Ms. Harris said. Downtown is literally underwater. I have never seen this much flooding. New Bern is the largest city in Craven County, which has a population of 105,000. Some calls for rescue were also coming from outlying areas of the county, said Amber Parker, a county spokeswoman. A resident, Grace Wendell, who lives about a quarter-mile south of the Trent River, said I have never seen this much flooding in New Bern and I have lived here 53 years. 5 swiftwater rescue teams and volunteers were responding to calls from people who were stranded, Ms. Parker said. She said many calls were for multiple people in need of help, including one from a home in the low-lying Fairfield Harbor neighborhood, with 9 people who were heading to the attic. New Bern has been one of the hardest hit areas because of its location, where the Trent and Neuse rivers meet, and the direction of the storm. The city was one of the first areas to be hit by strong winds and heavy rain, both of which lasted all of Thursday afternoon and into Friday morning. The big key point with New Bern and our Outer Banks and the Sounds is that the wind is directed right on shore, said Steve Pfaff, a meteorologist in the Nation Weather Service's office in Wilmington. It piles up. That water has nowhere to go. Trent Court, a public housing complex that sits by the river, floods even in minor rainstorms, but it has never flooded quite like this. A resident for several years, Essence Keys, 25, managed to get her 2 little boys to her grandmother's house on Wednesday. On Thursday afternoon, she looked out the window to see water out front. Walking outside, it was up to her ankles. She managed to get her 7-year-old's dirt bike off the ground, but she had time for little else. A friend had come to pick her up and take her to work. When I was walking out my back door, the water was already coming in my front door, she said. She left her flooded apartment for her shift at a nursing home. It was a particularly hectic shift, since residents of another nursing home had been brought to this one, while some of her co-workers were dealing with their own flooded homes. Here are 5 ways to avoid the risks associated with floodwaters. She worked on Thursday, spent the night at the home, and is back at work until Friday afternoon. When the shift ends, she hopes to go get her children, whom she has not heard from for more than a day. Her grandmother has no power and no cell phone, and is in a part of town with water in the streets. Back at Trent Court, people she knows talk of water up to the 4th or 5th step in the staircases leading up from the 1st floor. "I don't have nothing but the clothes that I had on yesterday," Miss Keys said. Read more about the flooding in New Bern. A warning that the threat is going to last for days. Governor Cooper painted a grim picture of the destruction Florence was inflicting. Wind gusts as high as 105 miles per hour has been recorded near Wilmington. The State Highway Patrol had responded to 30 vehicle collisions and more than 100 calls for help. Hundreds of rescues had taken place already, and more were underway. Several state roads remained underwater and impassable in the coastal area. Read about how to make an emergency kit, plan ahead and stay informed. The governor warned of forecasts that predicted 1,000-year rainfall in some areas, rainfall so severe it has a 1 in 1,000 chance of occurring in any given year. The state's rivers are rising, and will continue to rise, in some places to record levels, Mr. Cooper said. The ground is already saturated by recent rains, he said, raising the risk of flash flooding. He expected mudslides and rockslides as the storm moved inland.